Hi, this is my response to Module 11 perspective question. The most popular question here, I think it was again Ariana who asked it, but it says this: the UN era became has 39 upvotes. The UN era became littered with self-defense claims of various degrees of credibility, from the obvious to the risible. In particular, actions that previously would have been unashamedly presented as reprisals now tended to be deftly relabeled as self-defense. Is this to say that the UN has? The question: based on that, is this to say that the UN has become increasingly corrupt over the years? And if so, what are a few examples of this phenomenon? So I'm not going to give you a few, I'll just give you one. But because I actually, well, we'll start with sort of the foundation first. So the foundation is this: is the UN Charter bans the use of force or the threat of the use of force in the world, right? States should not. It's against the UN Charter. It's against the international legal system that the countries have signed up for any state to use force or to threaten to use force unilaterally. And in this case, unilaterally means without the approval, without the backing, without the say-so of the UN Security Council, right? So um, all use of force is banned. Now, of course, there is a provision in that ban, an exception, and the exception is this: if it's in self-defense from an armed attack, right? So the idea is if there's any security situation, you don't use force, you don't threaten force, you go to the UN Security Council and you ask them to fix it for you, right? You say, this is a situation, we need action. Now, there's a recognition in that there might be a case where you haven't got time to do that. If another state is attacking your state, um, and it's nice. I just read a law paper there about this before I answered the question, and you find some sort of controversy, some discussion around, how serious does the armed attack have to be? Some states have argued that no, it has to threaten the existence of your state. So it can't just be a sort of a small border clash, a small border, not clash, I should say, a small armed attack, a limited armed attack. It has to be an armed attack that threatens your very existence. So that's one perspective. Another perspective is, if at all there's any soldiers from another state that are coming at you, that's an armed attack, and you should be able to use force. Right, so this is when is it acceptable to use force? The answer is never, except when you have, according to the UN Charter, except for when you're under a real armed attack. Now, so the point of the quote that you're doing is that, okay, if that's the only reason, if that's the only way we can use armed force, then actually what we'll do is anytime we use armed force, we'll say it's in self-defense. And so what Neff is arguing here is that you see now a lot of these acts of self-defense that in the past we would have clearly seen as not acts of self-defense, right? But they have to argue that they're self-defense because that's the only conditions under which they're allowed to use armed force. So now if every use of armed force is a self-defense, it starts to now erode this idea of what self-defense really means, right? And it's quite clear in the charter, right? There's self-defense. There's different texts, different languages. I think the French one says something like armed aggression. Most of the versions have some sort of much more tight idea about when you can use force, and it's an armed invasion or an armed attack from another state. In all of the circumstances, you're supposed to go to the UN Security Council. Now, even in the case of self-defense, you're allowed to use the force to defend yourself. But even in using the force, you're supposed to at the same time go to the UN and say, look, there's no time to deliberate before we use armed force. We're going to use armed force now to stop this invasion, this attack. And while we're doing that, we're talking in the UN Security Council, and they'll come up with a more permanent solution to this. And so that's how it's supposed to work. So the example that I'll give, it's the example I read in that paper that I just read. Let me reference the paper since I'm. It's the DePaul Law Review is the journal. It's written by Fu Shun Lin. This is from 1963, right? So hence, I'm going to give you quite an old example, but it's also a British example, so I like that. All right. And the example is this: the Suez Crisis. So just a very quick brief history of the Suez Crisis. You can look it up if you want more details. But Britain and France, well, let's say Egypt, Nasser in Egypt, decides to nationalize, take into Egyptian ownership, public ownership, the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal had been run by a company that the British and the French were controlling, that were benefiting from. And of course, it's important to the British. This is back in the 50s. It's important to the British. It's just after the Second World War. It gives them access to their empire, right? That's through that canal, the shipping, empire shipping. And I suppose the French had similar interests in it as well. So when the Egyptians nationalized it, took it under Egyptian control, forcibly bought it from that British French company, they wanted to take it back, right? They didn't want to give it up to the Egyptians. So what they did is they tried to orchestrate something with the Israelis where the Israelis sort of move towards Egypt, get involved in a bit of a small armed conflict with the Egyptians, and then in order to keep the peace, the British and the French go into the canal, and not into the canal obviously, but into the canal area to sort of keep the peace, and then they take back control of the canal. So that was the idea. And that was, so it was a plan between the British, the French, and the Israelis to get the canal back. And so when they're justifying this, when the British government goes into Parliament, the British Parliament, and argues we need to send troops to the Suez Canal, we need to go to war, basically, with the Egyptians, the opposition MPs in Parliament say, no, you can't do that. That's against international law. This is, the UN Charter says that we signed up to just recently, within the last decade or so, says that we can't use any armed force except for self-defense. Right? And then, of course, the British government says, no, this is self-defense. This is actually an act of self-defense because the nationalization of the Suez Canal was equivalent to an armed attack. And so that's the point that Neff's making here. Is that's you look at the circumstances yourself for more details on it to sort of verify this. But in my opinion, right, it's quite a stretch, even as a British person, right? It's quite a stretch to claim that an economic nationalization of the Suez Canal is equivalent to an armed attack on Britain. It doesn't seem like the intention of the UN Charter to me. Now, there's other options available at the time. We don't have to respond with force or the use of force. The UN Charter seems to prohibit it in that case. But we could go to the Security Council, right, and have them. We could go to the Security Council and say, look, the nationalization of the Suez Canal is threatening peace and stability in the world. We have to come up with a solution, and have the Security Council come up with a solution. The Security Council can authorize the use of force, right? So if they do that, maybe they would have done that in that case, although probably not, right? The Egyptians were working quite closely with the Soviets at the time, who had a seat on the permanent seat on the Security Council. So they might not have got any joy from that, right? But which is probably why they went the route they went. But the point is that the UN Charter is supposed to outlaw the use of force, and so states that get around that claim self-defense, and they claim self-defense in situations that, to Neff and probably to many of us, right, seem like they're not legitimately immediate need of armed force to prevent a full-on armed attack that threatens the existence of Britain. It was economically harmful, it was politically harmful, geopolitically harmful to Britain to have the canal in Egyptian hands, absolutely. But did it constitute an armed attack on the United Kingdom? Probably not. So that's the point of that. I think that's interesting. In terms of law, one of the things, like if we sort of put it back to its general impact on international law, for me one of the interesting things is this: that so international law doesn't necessarily prevent the Suez crisis. In the end, the Americans step in economically and put a lot of economic pressure on Britain, and Britain has to stand back and France as well. The Americans tell the British and the French to behave themselves, and so they end up withdrawing their forces. But the interesting thing that it says about international law is that international law doesn't always prevent the thing that it's trying to prevent, but it's not that it has no effect. right? It has some effect. And the effect that it has is that we have to find a justification now. If international law had no effect, right, then the British would have just gone ahead and done it and not talked about a justification of self-defense or anything like that. They wouldn't have even felt the need to go through that. So international law does something, right? People at least want to appear to be following it, even if they have to, stretch things quite a lot to be able. Even if it's unconvincing, they still make some attempt to claim to be in compliance with it. And so that to me is an interesting outcome, right? It suggests that that many states, if not all states, sort of concede the legitimacy of that sort of a law. Even when it's inconvenient for them, and even when they don't ultimately follow it completely, they want to at least pay it lip service. So that to me is something. There. All right, I'm going to end this video there. I hope that was an interesting answer to the question. I think it does directly answer the question, and so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.